Krishna. Welcome back to our study of the Yoga Sutras. In this particular session, we are going to discuss Sutra number 16. In the previous Sutra, we saw how Patanjali defines what dispassion or vairagya is. There, he defines dispassion as freedom from cravings, mastery over cravings from the sense objects. And with this particular Sutra, Patanjali is going to take this meaning to a totally next level. What is the highest form of dispassion is going to be defined in this particular sutra. So today's session is going to be a little technically challenging. So I will encourage you to pause the video and rewind and understand the concept thoroughly as we proceed through this slightly complicated sutra. So let's see today's sutra. This is how it goes. Tat param purusha khyater guna vaitrishnam. So tat, remember the word that, which means that vairagya, that dispassion that was spoken of in the previous sutra, param, in its highest form. So that param vairagya, or the highest dispassion, how does it manifest? Purusha khyate, when there is realization of the self, right, of one's true identity, of the soul, right, and it is marked by guna vaitrishnam, where one rises beyond the influence of the modes, right? Remember the word vaitrishna in the previous sutra also, we use the word vishaya vitrishna. Vitrishna, we define it as cravings, hankerings for vishayas, the sense objects. The word vaitrishna is opposite to vitrishna, where you are indifferent, where you are beyond that cravings, right? So this is how the translation goes, that the highest dispassion is in being indifferent to the modes of material nature and by realization of the Purusha, our true identity, right? Let's see how the sutra is recited. Tat param purusha khyater guna vaitrishnam. Right? So to understand this particular sutra, let's go back. If you remember in sutra number 2, when we discussed yoga chitta vritti nirodha, we understood the concept of how the soul, our real self, is in an unchanging state while the world around us is constantly changing. And we use the term sat and asat to identify this unchanging and changing states, right? So that these two concepts of the soul and matter, the Sankhya philosophy, which is the foundation for yoga philosophy as well, it uses specific terminologies called as Purusha and Prakruti. So the soul is called Purusha and the entire matter is called Prakruti. Now, when I say matter, I don't just mean the world outside, but even this body, the mind, the intelligence, the false ego, these are all constituents of Prakruti, right? Just the soul, the pure soul, with that living entity, which is the embodiment of consciousness, right? That is the Purusha. Everything else that we interact with is Prakruti, right? And the Sankhya philosophy explains that right now, this Purusha and Prakruti are very strongly entangled, right? Because of ignorance or avidya, this Purusha and Prakruti, they are entangled, which means that the Purusha very strongly starts identifying with Prakruti, right? Just like how we very strongly identify with our body, our mind, our intelligence, right? Sometimes even with our possessions, we very strongly identify with that, right? So this entangled state is our material life or our material conditioning. So this material conditioning, it happens in successive layers, right? So this whole, covering of the Purusha with matter, there are multiple layers that the Sankhya philosophy talks about. In fact, Sankhya philosophy talks about how this Prakruti matter has 24 components. And we'll not go into the details of those 24 components, but in a very more understandable way, at the most base level, at the most subtlest level, the Purusha is covered by its false ego, intelligence, and mind, right? The Ahankara, Buddhi, and Manas. So these are the three layers which are covering. This is also called as a subtle body or the Sukshma Deha, right? So this in together is our inner space. If you remember, we discussed this concept in the second sutra as well, that the chitta expresses its awareness through these three channels. So these are the three subtle layers which are covering the Purusha. And on the outer layer, external layer, we see there is the body and senses, right? And beyond the body and senses, this whole world around us is basically comprised of these Pancha Mahabhutas, which are called as earth, water, fire, air, and ether, right? These are the 5 physical elements. And this whole, the successive coverings which are happening, it is described that this whole covering, it happens from the subtle to physical, right? Which means it begins with the false ego, the intelligence, the mind, then the body and senses, and then ether, air, fire, water, earth, right? In fact, some of the subtle aspects may be difficult to comprehend, but it's amazing how beautifully Sankhya philosophy describes, even if you connect it with the 5 physical elements, ether, air, fire, water, and earth. This is how, even the physical matter, forms, right? Like, for example, if you think of how the modern science, for example, explains creation, they like to talk about some big bang taking place, right? But even if you analyze post that particular bang, what happens? What is the first thing that happens? From a point of singularity, right, came the big bang, and what happened there? Space manifested, physical space, distance, and that is the characteristic of ether. Now, moment there is space, it has to be filled with something, right? And it is filled with all these air and all the other, smaller gases like hydrogen and helium and so on. And when these gases, they started rubbing with these, and friction was produced, and that's how fire, a lot of energy, a lot of heat was produced. And because of that heat, these smaller elements, they started transforming into bigger elements, and it all became into a fluid state, that is the water. And as things started to cool down, things solidified, and that's how planets and stars and big gigantic galaxies were formed. This is how the modern science likes to explain the creation post Big Bang. You can see they are talking about similar, formation of elements. Or if you look at the way Ayurveda, again, based on Sankhya philosophy again, how Ayurveda explains our own formation within our mother's womb, right? So what happens at the time of conception is, first, there is a designated space decided that, okay, this is where the child will eventually grow inside the mother's womb. So ether comes into existence. And once the child's formation begins, pranavayu, life airs start manifesting inside. And once, the embryo starts to form, life begins, heat is produced. That's a symptom of life. That is a fire component, right? And gradually inside the embryo, there are a lot of embryonic fluids that are first formed. That is a water component. And gradually, as they start to, form different organs of the body, the bones, the muscles, the heart, the tissues, the skin, right? Slowly the earth, the solid components are formed. And you see how beautifully that same evolution from ether to earth, is something applicable even in the formation of our own physical bodies. So we understand that, this whole concept of how matter, right? How there is this evolution happening, how the Purusha's consciousness is going through an evolution within the domain of matter, whether be it from the microcosmic level of our own body to the macrocosmic level of this universe. We see that there is an evolution from the subtle to physical, from the subtle to gross, the physical external elements. So this is the foundation of the Sankhya philosophy's explanation of how this Purusha Prakruti entanglement happens, what exactly is this physical world, how this physical world has evolved from, the subtle elements to its physical elements. Now, this concept is going to be key for us, because you see, what are we trying to do finally? We are trying to, through our yoga practice, we are trying to disentangle the Purusha from Prakruti. So the so-called misidentification which has happened, we are trying to disentangle the Purusha's consciousness from matter. So for this disconnection to happen, right, if the connection process has happened from the subtle to external, then the disconnection process has to happen in reverse process, right? It has to happen from external to the subtle. And this specifically, there's a term that is used, it is called involution, right? If evolution was what happened in the first place, how the entanglement or the material bondage happened, it was evolution from the subtle elements to the physical elements. The disconnection of the Purusha's consciousness, our consciousness from matter, has to happen outside in, right? So that outside in approach is what is called as involution. And this is the foundation of Patanjali's philosophy. In fact, all the practices that is going to talk about later on in the book, you will see he's going to address an outside in approach, right? He's going to talk about how, fix your outermost layer of your life, which is your social, angle. Fix the social aspect of your life, then fix your lifestyle aspect, then fix your physical aspect, then fix your mental, emotional aspect. And that is how he wants us to go deeper and deeper. So this involution is going to be a key concept that is going to come throughout this book, right? So if you understand the foundation, why did Patanjali introduce this concept of involution, or why was his thought process along this line? Because the Sankhya philosophy explains that the Purusha's consciousness evolves into the domain of matter from subtle to physical. And if I want to reverse that, if I want to bring the Purusha back to its original state, then the disconnection, I have to peel the layers from outside in. It's like the famous example of the Russian dolls. If you remember, there's a doll inside a doll inside a doll. If I want to bring out the innermost doll, right, I have to unpack the dolls in the same order in which I packed them in the first place, right? Like that, we have to unpack those layers. By unpacking those layers, right, what does it mean? It means that the soul slowly starts to reduce its identification with those layers. And that is what the whole process of involution is. And because we are trying to reduce that connection and identification, this is what vairagya, this is what dispassion in its deepest meaning means. Tat param purushakhyate guna avaitrishnam. So the highest form of the dispassion is where one becomes free from the influence of material energy. So gunas here, or the modes of material nature, basically means the influence of material energy. And that highest dispassion comes when one becomes self-realized, when you have peeled all those outer layers and come to the innermost, the kernel, the real substance, that is the Purusha, that is the soul. That is the highest form of dispassion. So basically here Patanjali is warning to us that, look, it is dispassion doesn't just mean that you're free from, you become indifferent to your desires, or you have kind of learn to steer your life without getting affected by likes and dislikes. Just developing mastery over your cravings in itself is not dispassion. There is a highest level of dispassion which comes only when you are self-realized. So Patanjali is giving us, what is that ultimate goal? Don't settle for a lower goal. There is, it's going to be a long race. It's a long marathon. So don't just settle down after achieving 1 or 2 milestones, right? So this whole journey from the beginning stages of dispassion to the param vairagya, to the highest stage of dispassion, has been explained very beautifully in the yogic texts. It talks about a 5-level progress in the stages of dispassion. It all begins with what is called as Yatamana. Yatamana here means where one begins, a desire develops. I want to now disengage from this worldliness. I don't want to get influenced by matter anymore. So you begin by controlling one of your senses, right? So suppose, let us say somebody is over addicted to food. So at least that sense of tongue, which is one of the important senses to control. So one begins by focusing on one sense. It is, there's an expression of intent. One is at least mindfully living one's life at this stage, trying to disengage from the overindulgence of one of the senses. Gradually, as that practice happens, right, then one comes to a stage called as Vyatireka. Vyatireka literally means opposite, which means now the senses have a natural attraction towards sense objects. My eyes are attracted to see something very naturally beautiful. My nose is attracted to smell something which is naturally fragrant. My ears like to hear something very pleasant. So all the senses, they have a natural tendency towards, rush towards the sense object. It's like a magnetic attraction between the senses and sense objects. That turns opposite. That is Vyatireka. At this stage, right, it is loosely translated as desireless, but literally what it means is one is now starting to turn inwards. Now the senses, it's not just one sense, but all your senses, you are very consciously starting to now turn inwards. And after that Vyatireka comes the stage called as Ekendriya. Now you have become one-pointed. Now the senses, are not agitating anymore. Otherwise, in our normal state, the senses are just rushing towards the sense objects, but now they have become more balanced, right? There may be some small traces of desire still left at the mental level, but at least through our physical practice, we have learned to control our physical energies. The pranic energies have been controlled, so the senses are no more running outwards, right? There may be some small traces of desires, of those cravings in the mind. While there may be some small cravings, there is also parallelly a desire towards self-realization. This is a very advanced stage. Ekendriya, one-pointedness is a very advanced stage, because at this stage one is very firmly rooted in one's endeavors towards spirituality and self-realization. But there may be some occasional traces of those cravings coming up. But beyond that comes a state called as Vashikara. This is where now, with that strong intellectual discrimination, one has developed self-mastery. Now the senses are no more agitating. One has, developed a complete control over their senses, right? And one is so fixed up. It is even at the Ekendriya, at the one-pointedness state, there may still be some small traces of cravings, but at the stage of Vashikara or self-mastery, one has mastered their mind and senses, right? And this is the stage of discrimination that we spoke about in the previous sutra, right? Now, for somebody at this point, it may seem like, look, game over. I have developed self-mastery. What lies beyond self-mastery? There can be nothing more. Somebody can mistake it, right? Therefore, Patanjali is specifically addressing in this sutra, there is one more stage beyond this Vashikara, beyond self-mastery. There's another level called as Para Vairagya. Very similar to that word Param that we are seeing in this sutra and the word Vairagya, which you saw in the previous sutra. Param Vairagyam or Para Vairagya is the highest form of this Vairagya or dispassion. That is a stage where one completely transcends the influence of these three material modes. What are the material modes? These are Sattva, Rajas, and Tamas. Right? At the level of Vashikara, the Chitta, the mind may still have very strong Sattvic influences, which is also a kind of a bondage if you look at it objectively. But at Para Vairagya, one transcends all these three modes. One is no more influenced by Sattva, Rajas, and Tamas. This is the highest stage, right? So what happens at this stage? Does it mean that, one completely just sublimates into thin air, one just disappears, one is beyond matter? What does it mean to transcend the three modes, right? It means, right, if you look at this, at that Para Vairagya, that highest form of dispassion, what happens when one transcends the influence of three modes, then the Purusha, the consciousness of the Purusha completely turns inwards. One is looking no more towards material energy, but looking at spiritual energy, right? This is the important aspect, right? So many times we may think, dispassion or detachment makes one completely inert, but at a spiritual level, at a higher level, if you see, actually, detachment from matter and attachment to spirit, they are one and the same. They are like two sides of the same coin. You cannot have one without the other, right? So if you look at it, in a more deeper way, real attachment comes through real detachment comes through complete attachment, right? Real detachment from matter comes through complete attachment to spirit. And that is the state, that Param Vairagya, which is being spoken of in this particular sutra, where one becomes completely attached, or by attachment, again, do not misunderstand it from a worldly materialistic sense, but where one becomes completely self-situated. The consciousness is now turned inwards towards oneself, towards the soul, towards self-realization, the Purusha, that is the spirit. And this is the the highest state of dispassion, and that is a state that an aspiring yogi wants to reach. Now, how this is to happen, right, is going to be a subject matter for the remainder of the book, right? But very quickly, I will summarize what we discussed today, a slightly technical topic today. So first topic we understood is that how this Purusha and Prakruti, how they are entangled, and how there is an evolution of consciousness of the Purusha in the domain of matter. Like the example that we gave of those dolls, the Russian dolls, the doll within a doll within a doll, like that, our consciousness is being covered by different material layers. This is the evolution. And if I want to reverse it, right, I need to involute. And that involution process is essentially what the entire Patanjali's Ashtanga Yoga process is based upon. This is going to be the foundation concept to understand the remainder of the book, right? And when this involution happens, it does not mean that you become stoneless, lifeless, you don't lose your identity, but rather at that stage, that real involution, when it happens, when the real detachment happens, the detachment from matter happens only when that attachment to your real identity, to the spirit, happens. And these two are one and the same. And how this involution can be effectively understood, right? And what are those inner states of a very advanced yogi who's going through this involution is going to be very beautifully described in the next sutra. So please stay tuned and join us for the remainder of this course. Thank you so much. Hare Krishna.